Ricky Skaggs is a name etched deep into the heart of country and bluegrass music. A child prodigy who played with legends before most kids even learned their ABCs, Skaggs grew into one of the most decorated musicians in Nashville history. With more than a dozen Grammy Awards, countless hit records, and a career that bridged the gap between traditional bluegrass and mainstream country, his place in the Grand Ole Opry is undeniable. But behind the banjos and fiddles, behind the warm, Southern smile and gospel-inspired faith, there's another story, one of rivalries, bruised egos, and quiet resentments. The Grand Ole Opry may be a symbol of tradition and unity, but backstage, it's a battlefield where personalities clash and careers collide. And for Ricky Skaggs, a man who stood proudly for authenticity in a world often tempted by commercial gloss, there were plenty of fellow artists he simply could not stand. Some of these names are expected, competitors who challenged him for dominance on the Opry stage. Others are shocking, country icons who fans would never imagine being on Skaggs' bad side. Yet, through candid conversations and years of whispers from Nashville insiders, a list emerges of 7 Opry artists who crossed the wrong man at the wrong time. At 71, Ricky Skaggs isn't afraid to let the truth slip. And the truth is, some feuds in country music never die. To understand Ricky Skaggs' complicated relationships within the Grand Ole Opry, you first have to understand the man himself. Born in Cordell, Kentucky in 1954, Ricky wasn't just another kid with a guitar dream. He was a bona fide child prodigy. By the age of 6, he was already picking a mandolin with precision far beyond his years. At just 7, he had his first taste of national attention when he appeared on television alongside none other than Bill Monroe, the father of bluegrass. Imagine that. Most kids were still fumbling through nursery rhymes, and young Ricky was keeping up with Monroe on stage. His early years were steeped in tradition. Skaggs learned the discipline of bluegrass from Monroe and later played with Ralph Stanley and the Clinch Mountain Boys, absorbing every note, every nuance of old-time mountain music. Those lessons never left him. Even when country music began chasing commercial trends in the late 1970s and 1980s, Skaggs remained fiercely protective of tradition, carrying the torch for authentic bluegrass while making it accessible to mainstream audiences. By the early 1980s, Skaggs' career was skyrocketing. His blend of traditional bluegrass instrumentation with contemporary country flair resulted in a string of hits, including Crying My Heart Out Over You, Highway 40 Blues, and Heartbroke. He didn't just play the Opry, he re-energized it, reminding audiences why fiddles, banjos, and mandolins mattered in an age when slick production was beginning to dominate Nashville. His commitment to roots music earned him widespread respect, but also quiet resentment. In Nashville, being a purist can make you both a hero and a target. While many admired Skaggs' talent, others viewed him as rigid, unwilling to bend to the ever-evolving face of country music. He wasn't shy about voicing his opinions either, often criticizing those who, in his eyes, betrayed the tradition for radio success. Skaggs officially became a member of the Grand Ole Opry in 1982, cementing his place among the legends. For him, it was not just an honor but a responsibility. The Opry wasn't just a stage, it was a sacred institution, and Ricky took it seriously, sometimes too seriously for others' liking. He was known to clash with artists who treated the Opry as just another gig rather than the hallowed ground it represented. That same seriousness, however, helped make him a pillar of the Opry's revival during the 1980s. He drew in younger audiences, preserved old traditions, and connected country's past with its future. Ricky wasn't just performing, he was educating, ensuring that Monroe's mandolin and Stanley's mountain harmonies weren't lost in a sea of polished pop country. But as Ricky's star rose, so did the whispers. For all his talent and success, Skaggs developed a reputation as someone who could be hard-headed, uncompromising, and at times, downright dismissive of fellow musicians who didn't share his vision. That unshakable devotion to keeping it real made him enemies, enemies who also happened to share the Opry stage. The Grand Ole Opry may have looked like one big family from the audience's perspective, but behind the curtain, Ricky Skaggs' relationships were far more complicated, and soon some of the most surprising names in country music would find themselves on the wrong side of Ricky's respect. The Grand Ole Opry has always projected an image of unity, artists standing together, honoring tradition and keeping country music's flame alive. But behind the scenes, the Opry is not unlike any other workplace filled with strong personalities, fragile egos, and unspoken rivalries. Ricky Skaggs, with his sharp ear for authenticity and uncompromising vision for country's future, often found himself at the center of these tensions. One of the earliest points of friction came when Skaggs began dominating the Opry stage in the early 1980s. While audiences adored his youthful energy and masterful musicianship, some older members quietly resented the spotlight shifting to him. Opry veterans who had fought for years to earn their place suddenly found themselves overshadowed by a bluegrass prodigy barely in his 30s. Skaggs wasn't trying to steal the show, he was simply doing what came naturally. But the imbalance created simmering tension. The rivalries weren't always about talent. They were often about ideology. Ricky Skaggs believed the Opry was sacred ground, a place where tradition should always come first. But not everyone agreed. Artists who leaned toward the more polished Nashville sound or the emerging country-politan style often clashed with him, sometimes quietly, sometimes openly. To Ricky, replacing fiddles and steel guitars with strings and synthesizers was a betrayal. To others, it was just evolution. One infamous backstage exchange whispered about for years involved Skaggs calling out a fellow Opry star for watering down the music to chase radio airplay. The remark, though never repeated publicly, spread quickly among the Opry family. From that moment, some artists viewed him not just as a peer, but as a self-appointed gatekeeper, quick to judge and slow to forgive. But the rivalries weren't limited to stylistic disagreements. The Opry is also about showmanship, and Ricky's perfectionism sometimes rubbed others the wrong way. He was meticulous about rehearsal, timing, and performance quality. When other artists treated the Opry as a casual stop between tours, Ricky bristled. He once remarked in an interview that the Opry isn't just another stage, it's the stage, a comment many interpreted as a dig at those who didn't share his reverence. Still, it wasn't all sour notes. Ricky had deep respect for artists who upheld tradition, even when they didn't see eye to eye. His friendships with figures like Bill Monroe, Ralph Stanley, and later Vince Gill showed that mutual respect could transcend differences. But with others, the clashes were unavoidable, and the backstage atmosphere could grow tense. For Ricky, these rivalries weren't personal, at least not always. They were about protecting something bigger than himself, the integrity of the music. But for those on the receiving end, his fiery devotion could feel like arrogance. And over time, a list of names began to build. Artists who either dismissed him, clashed with him, or flat out butted heads. By the 1990s, Ricky Skaggs was no longer just a young prodigy. He was a central figure at the Opry, wielding influence and carrying both fans and detractors in equal measure. And while audiences only saw the polished performances under the bright lights, the real drama was unfolding behind the curtain. In Nashville, grudges are rarely forgotten, and for Ricky Skaggs, some would follow him well into his 70s. By the 1990s, Ricky Skaggs had established himself not just as a hitmaker, but as a man with a mission. His career had weathered the storms of Nashville trends, and his personal life was rooted in faith and family. Skaggs never shied away from his Christian beliefs, often weaving them into his interviews, music, and even conversations with fellow Opry stars. For many, this was admirable, proof that in a world of fame and temptation, Ricky stayed grounded. But for others, His outspoken convictions only made him more polarizing. Faith played a double role in his feuds. On one hand, it gave Ricky the strength to handle criticism and the resilience to keep fighting for tradition. On the other, it sometimes fueled his sharp opinions about the music and behavior of others. He wasn't afraid to say when he thought an artist's lyrics were too commercial, too shallow, or too far removed from the roots of country and bluegrass. Some appreciated his honesty, others found it sanctimonious. This tension only grew as country music entered the era of stadium tours and crossover hits. The 1990s and 2000s saw artists like Garth Brooks and Shania Twain dominate the airwaves with a polished, pop-infused sound. Skaggs, who had already shifted back to pure bluegrass by the late 90s, made no secret of his disdain for the direction mainstream country was heading. To him, the glitter and theatrics of these new stars diluted the soul of the genre. And though he rarely named names in public, those backstage at the Opry knew exactly which artists he was talking about. Fame also complicated things. Ricky was respected, but fame in Nashville is a double-edged sword. Those who achieve it quickly are often resented. Those who cling to tradition are sometimes dismissed as outdated. Skaggs walked a fine line between both. His Grammy wins and Opry spotlight made him a superstar, but his refusal to play the game often isolated him. Behind closed doors, he was known to challenge fellow artists in conversations about music's future, sometimes leaving the impression that he was lecturing rather than collaborating. Some feuds, however, went beyond music. Like any close-knit community, the Opry had its share of personal disagreements, scheduling conflicts, disputes over billing, or even personality clashes in the green room. Ricky, with his perfectionism and deep passion, could sometimes come off as intense. Friends described him as warm and generous, but only once you were firmly in his circle of trust. For others, he could feel like a wall that was impossible to climb. Yet, despite the friction, Ricky's role as a defender of tradition never wavered. His faith reminded him that grudges, while human, were not meant to last forever. Over the years, he mended some relationships, showing grace and forgiveness. But there were still artists he simply could not reconcile with, voices and personalities that clashed too deeply with his own convictions. As Ricky grew older, the feuds became less about personal irritation and more about legacy. The question was no longer who was selling more records, but who was protecting the true spirit of the Opry. And in that battle, Ricky Skaggs remained unyielding. At 71, when reflecting on his career and the people who crossed his path, he could name 7 Grand Ole Opry artists who tested his patience, challenged his beliefs, and even earned his dislike. Some names might surprise you, others not so much. But all of them reveal the complicated reality of life behind the curtain of the Opry. When Ricky Skaggs looks back on his decades at the Grand Ole Opry, his respect for the institution is unquestionable. He loved the stage, the traditions, and the fans. But not every fellow performer won his admiration. Through a mix of stylistic clashes, personal disagreements, and ideological battles over the soul of country music, Skaggs built a quiet list of artists who never earned his blessing. Some rivalries were short-lived, others stretched on for years. Here are 7 names insiders say tested his patience the most. Porter Wagoner. Though a legend in his own right, Porter was known for his flashy rhinestone suits and larger-than-life personality. Ricky, who preferred humility and tradition, often found Wagoner's showbiz flair excessive. Their backstage conversations could be tense, as Skaggs felt Wagoner represented the Opry's drift towards spectacle rather than substance. Garth Brooks. The king of 1990s country superstardom, Garth brought stadium rock energy into Nashville. While fans adored him, Skaggs saw his success as proof that authenticity was being sacrificed for commercial appeal. The two reportedly had polite interactions, but philosophically they couldn't have been further apart. Barbara Mandrell, known for her crossover success and polished image, Mandrell clashed with Skaggs' insistence on traditional roots. Ricky admired her talent but bristled at her pop-influenced style, which he believed diluted the purity of country music. Hank Williams Jr. Loud, rowdy, and rebellious, Hank Jr. represented everything Ricky disliked about country's shift toward outlaw excess. Their musical philosophies couldn't have been more different. While Skaggs sought reverence and order, Hank Jr. thrived on chaos and defiance. Reba McEntire. While Ricky respected her vocal power, he often criticized the heavy production and crossover approach of Reba's music. He saw her as someone who leaned too far into commercial territory at the expense of traditional country storytelling. Vince Gill. This may come as a shock, since the two occasionally performed together, but insiders suggest tension existed. Vince, though deeply rooted in tradition, embraced contemporary influences with more ease than Ricky. Their backstage disagreements often centered on how far country could stretch before breaking. Shania Twain, perhaps the most predictable, feud. Shania's pop country explosion in the 1990s was the antithesis of everything Skaggs stood for. To him, her massive hits symbolized Nashville's surrender to mainstream trends. Though never openly hostile, Ricky made no secret of his disdain for her brand of country. Taken together, this list tells a story bigger than personal grudges. Ricky Skaggs wasn't a man who hated lightly. His hatred often sprang from a place of disappointment rather than malice. He believed the Opry should safeguard tradition, and anyone who strayed too far from that path risked his disapproval. At 71, Ricky has softened with age, often reflecting with more grace than bitterness. Yet the tensions he carried reveal the deep divisions within country music itself, a genre forever torn between honoring its roots and chasing the future. For Skaggs, those 7 names will always serve as reminders of the battles he fought, the lines he refused to cross, and the legacy he worked tirelessly to protect.